Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee Workshop. Recently, while visiting a show house in Atlanta, Georgia, we came across an antique cart built in France, probably 100 years ago, that had been modified to become a coffee table, and we loved it. So we're going to take a visit to that house, show you the antique, rustle up some old pine boards and recondition them, and build our own version right here in the new Yankee Workshop. Well, today we're in Atlanta, Georgia, in an area called Buckhead, where we're visiting a model home that was built not long ago by some friends of ours at This Old House magazine. It was open to the public for a while, and everyone who came into this great room loved this piece of furniture. It's called the sheep shearer's table. We think it's of French origin, and you can imagine the animal being placed on this table and all that wool being sheared off. It could obviously be moved around. It has handles to lift it up, and there's some vestiges where an axle might have come through for some wheels. Made out of pine, mortise and tenon joinery. Very simple, but I love the size of it. It's huge. Plenty of room for books and magazines. Now, if I can dig up some old antique pine, I think we should build a couple of these. Well, here it is, our version of that sheep shearing table that we found in Atlanta. Well, I made mine out of some reclaimed pine. You could make it out of new pine, but I like the look of the old wood. I also found some old cut nails here in the shop, so I used those to attach the boards. I think it's a nice feature. And occasionally you'll see these square pegs at the intersection of joints. They're not functional, purely decorative. Now, making this out of reclaimed pine has important steps dealing with this old material. A friend of the show gave us this stock. He was doing a renovation. These happen to be studs, and they're great for the heavier parts of the project, like the rails and the stretchers. He also gave us some old flooring that's just covered with layers of paint, and that's good for the surface of the table. Now, the last thing I want to do is throw this material through my surface planer. There's always metal in these boards. Now, here is an obvious nail. Those are easy. You just pull them out with a hammer or a pair of pliers. They come out pretty easily. But there are always hidden pieces of metal. One way to find those is with a metal detector like this. You see these at airport security. You don't have to be in that business to get one of these. You can actually buy them at the home center now. You just turn it on and scan the board. And as you approach the metal, it'll set out the signal. There's something right there. Now, another version of a tool like that is this one, just a very small metal detector. And again, it's a matter of scanning the board, and we get a signal when there's a nail. Now we used whatever it takes to dig it out. A nail set, pliers, whatever you can find, and get rid of that metal. Now, occasionally there'll be bits under paint that you can't find. So the first thing that I like to do is sand off any paint. I could do that with an ordinary belt sander with a coarse grit paper, or I could use a machine like this. It's a drum sander. There's a drum around which you wrap a ribbon of abrasive, and I start with a very coarse abrasive, 36 grit. Then there's another belt right here, which is nothing more than a way that the material is transported under the drum. Now, before we use any power tools, let's talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there's no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now, you have to be patient with this machine. Take a little bit off with each pass. All right, that takes care of the surfaces. The next area of grit that I want to get rid of is along the edges. That would destroy the planer as well as my joiner knives. So I put a blade in the table saw that's ready to be sharpened, and I'll just rip 1/8 of an inch off of each edge. Now, with all the surfaces free of grit and paint, I can take it to my surface planer or the joiner without destroying the knives. Well, it took a few hours, but now I have enough stock to build another table. Now, we've learned over the years that taking this reclaimed pine and using it for projects like this is really the only way to go. You get an instant look of an antique. Now, the first thing that I want to do is work on this long top rail. And on one end it has a handle, on the other end it has this bevel. I've set up my miter gauge to cut the bevels. Now I'm using this gauge that has a really long fence, and that'll give me a lot of support. I wouldn't try to cut a piece like this with the narrow fence that comes with the saw. You just couldn't hold it steady. The other thing that I do is make sure that my table surface is in good condition and slick. So we clean it with an abrasive pad. And we put either automotive wax on it or other lubricants that are commercially available. The whole idea is having it slick makes it much safer to do the woodworking. Now I've set the gauge at 15 degrees and I'll cut it off. Now with the miter gauge set at 15 degrees on the other side of 0, I'll cut the corresponding rail. Here I've made a poster board template to trace the shape of the handle, and it's off to the bandsaw to rough it out. To smooth up the cuts from the band saw, I'm going to use my oscillating spindle sander. Not only does it turn, but it rides up and down, distributing the wear over a larger area of the drum. But more importantly, the drum is 90 degrees to the table, which means when I smooth out the cut, I have a perpendicular surface when I'm done. The joinery of the frame is mortise and tenon. On the antique, these pegs went through the rail, then the tenon of the leg, and secured it in place. With the glues we have today, we don't need the pegs, but we want to have this feature. So now is the time to make some mortises for those pegs. They don't go all the way through. I've set up my mortiser with a 1/2-inch chisel, and to the depth I want. I have my layout marks, and all I have to do is cut them out. Now these mortises will actually do the work. This is where the tenon for the leg will fit into that rail. Over in this corner of the shop is our indispensable collection of woodworking jigs: a panel cutter, a raised panel maker, a louver door maker, shelf pin jig. The one I want today is my tapering jig. One pass through the joiner smooths up the saw cut. Each leg has a through mortise to receive the tenons from the short stretches. And that's a nice detail. So it's back to the mortiser again. Each leg has a mortise to receive the long stretcher, but it does not go through. I got started today forming one of the tenons at the top of the leg. It's going to fit into that mortise that we made yesterday. Now I want to show you the cuts that go into making this. There's a shoulder cut on each face and a cheek cut that makes that side of the tenon. On the edges, I can make a shoulder cut here, and generally I'll nibble away that material at the table saw. This one's at 90 degrees. If I flip it over to the tapered side and set it on my table saw, this is going to be at an angle. Can't nibble it away. So let's go through it step by step. First, we'll make the shoulder cut on the face. This is the 90-degree corner. Miter gauge is at 0. Slide it up against the stop block. Make the first cut. Now when I flip it over, there's a problem because of the taper. I'm not against the stop block. So I loosen up the miter gauge, swing it around until the gap is eliminated, tighten it down again, and now I can run it through. Okay, that takes care of the shoulder cuts on the side. Now it's to the bandsaw for the edges. To make the shoulder cuts on the edges, I've set up this fence and a stop. And all I have to do is keep it tight against the fence and guide it in. It's a shallow cut. With the fence moved over, even though I only have a couple inches of straight edge, with the bandsaw I have a chance of getting a good cut. I formed the tenon at the top of the narrow leg the same way as the wide one. Slip that into place and check it for squareness. I've also cut the long stretcher. This end has a 1.5-degree bevel, which matches the taper of the narrow leg. This end has a 5-degree bevel, which matches the taper of the wide leg. I have to form tenons on each end. The trick here is the same as with the legs. At 90 degrees on the miter gauge, I have a gap. I have to eliminate that before I make the cut. So I swing it around, make sure there's no gap, and then I'm ready to run it through. Now to get the opposing side, it's the same process. You'll be swinging it on the other side of 0. For the shoulder cuts on the edge of the stretchers, I want to make sure that the bevel is tight against the fence. And I again take the miter gauge and swing it around till there's no gap, lock it down, and make the cut. And that takes care of the cut along the edge of the tenon. Now it's back to the tenoning jig, and it's essential for these narrow, tall pieces. Well, now it's time for some glue up, and I use a yellow carpenter's glue, spread it with a brush, get a nice thin coating inside the mortise and on the tenon. This pine will suck it up quickly, so I don't have a lot of open time. Now for a clamp. And with clamps, the idea is to just put enough pressure to close up the joint. That's all you need. Now in the old days, it was the glue that would fail over time. And that meant that the pegs were essential to holding the joint together. But with these modern glues, they should hold up indefinitely. So we don't need the pegs, but we want them for that decorative look. While those frames set in the clamps for a while, let's start working on the short stretcher. No bevels, no tapers. All 90-degree cuts to form the tenon. I can do that all at the table saw. Let's take another look at the prototype. The boards on the top are about 5/8 of an inch thick, and they're connected with a tongue and groove joint. The first thing I want to do is make a groove in one edge of each board. So I've installed the dado for the narrowest width. I've put this feather board in place to make sure that the stock stays tight against the fence as I run it through. And I've set the fence so that I'm as close to the center of the board as possible. I'll make one pass through on this edge, turn it end for end, make another pass through, and that guarantees the groove will be centered. On the opposite edge of each board, there is a tongue that fits into that groove. Let me show you the setup for that. I'm going to pop off this fence, because when I set it back, it'll be exactly where I want it. You can see I've widened the dado to 3/8 of an inch. The sacrificial fence is necessary because part of the dado will be under the fence. And if I take a piece of stock and push it in there, you can see that it's set to remove just the right amount for the tongue. With that locked down, there's one more thing I want to do, and that's to keep the stock tight to the table. I take a piece that has yet to be formed, take my feather board, push it down tight, lock it in place, and I'm ready to go. Now I want to apply a hand plane here at the top edges to give it a little character. The next step is to get rid of all these sharp edges, and that'll be a two-step process. I'm starting with a chamfering bit, which will just knock off the corner about 1/8 of an inch of it. I'll go around all edges except this top edge where the boards get nailed on. Now the next step of the process is done with the random orbit sander. I'm not trying to create a particularly even edge. I want it to look like it's worn in. So if there's a little divot somewhere, I'll sand it a little bit more. To take the edges off the handle, I'm using a 1/2 inch round over bit. And I'll make a pass on each side, then I'll sand it all smooth. Well, now we're ready to install the short stretchers, which connect the two side assemblies. A little more glue, and a couple clamps will do the job. Well, now it's time to put on a top. So I've laid out the tongue and groove boards in no particular order. Before I can start fastening them, I have to take this first one and cut it at a 15-degree angle to match this angle. Now I'm just putting a dab of glue at the center of each board because I have a cross grain situation. I want to be able to let the board move a bit, but I also want to secure it well. Now for the first 12 inches, I can attach them with some brads because they're going to be covered by some other pieces later. Now these cut nails are not old, they're actually new. There's a company here in Massachusetts that still makes them. Now I like to drill a pilot hole for the nail. That way it'll minimize any splitting. And there's actually a direction. If you look at these nails, you can see it's tapered in this direction, but it's very uniform in thickness this way. And if you look at an old floor, you'll see that the long direction of the head runs parallel to the floor. And that's so the wood won't split. Well, here's the last piece, and you'll notice that on this end I just ripped it square. Now, I'm not certain why a sheep shearing table would need end boards, but on each end there's a board held in place with a little shaped bracket. Now I laid out the pieces. I'll cut them on the bandsaw, drum sand them smooth, and route them with a chamfer. All right, now I'm ready to attach these little brackets, and I'm going to clamp it in place, make sure it's even, and then I'm going to pre-drill for some screws, about a 45-degree angle. No glue here, just a couple screws. There are a couple boards that close off the ends. They're a ½ inch thick. This one has a little arch in the top of it. And down on the other end, it's a little bit wider. It's flat on the top, but it has a cutout on the bottom. I'll cut those on the bandsaw and smooth them up. Once again, I'm going to pre-drill and use some more of these cut nails. Now these little blocks are going to be our accent pegs. A little dab of glue on each one. Tap it into the hole. Wipe off the excess. Well, a little more sanding and this will be ready for the finishing shop. Well, the program for the finish on this piece is to first apply a quick drying sealer. And when that's dry, I'll give it a very light sanding with very fine sandpaper, a 220 grit. And then the top coat will be a combination stained polyurethane called honey pine. We've used it many times on projects. Here's a sample of what it looks like over the sealer. There's nothing better to finish this pine with. Well, here it is with its final coat of polyurethane, and we've set it up out here with a few potted plants. Now, whether you use this as a coffee table in your living room, or you might decide to use it out on a covered porch to display your plants, I hope you enjoy your sheep shearing table. It was a lot of fun to build.
Norm's not the only woodworker on the block anymore. That young British whippersnapper Paul Bradburn has another cutting-edge design in half an hour after home time next.